Let's talk about interconnectedness and impermanence for a minute. So, again, this one's fairly straightforward. Buddhists believe that everything is moving and changing and linked together. Just like that image there shows of kind of the world with the web, right? It's kind of like there's a web of stuff all around us that's always being influenced and interacting with everything else. And that's the essence of interconnectedness / impermanence. And it's important to note that those two things go together, right? Everything's impermanent, so it's always it could all die, and the plant when it dies becomes part of the soil, just like we do. But it's also interconnected. So even while it's alive, it's still interconnected and moving, and nothing is set in stone, according to the Buddhists. And there's some support for this in the idea that every 7 or 8 years or so, our cells completely regenerate. And so the cells on your arm right now are different than the ones you had before. Definitely our bodies change and grow. Think about the difference between how you were when you were 5 years old and how you are now, and how the great changes that your body undergoes throughout the aging process. So all of this suggests that we are all connected, changing beings. And it's sort of difficult for us to appreciate this because it's so easy to see ourselves as separate. Right? I seem like a professor, different from you. You seem like a student, different from me. Even if I'm just at a park watching a kid run around on the playground, that kid seems like an independent entity, like an independent thing. On the other hand, he couldn't exist without the air and the environment, right? He couldn't exist without his mother's love when he was younger, just like I couldn't have. He couldn't exist without all these other factors, without food. He couldn't exist if his heart wasn't pumping blood properly. So there's a number of factors that depend on his existence, however separate he seems. And going back to the dukkha, one of the reasons, again, we suffer is because we tend to see the world as permanent, discrete things. That tree, that camera, this remote, this professor, rather than seeing ourselves as part of a greater whole, as part of a machine, if you will, of nature, of the universe. Now, there's a criticism here of Buddhism that comes in, and some people say, okay, Mr. Buddhist, so you're telling me that we're all interconnected, are you? And that we're all impermanent. Well, then why don't you just jump out of a plane and kill yourself and just merge with the universe? Because after all, we're all one, so why does it matter if you're this physical body or if you're splat on the ground and connected to the earth again now? The response Buddhists have to that, and you'll see this in the reader, is called the twofold truth. So the twofold truth reminds us that at the deepest level of reality, the level of interconnectedness and impermanence, the true level of reality, everything's connected and impermanent. It reminds us that this is the true nature. This is what the Buddha saw during his meditation, that everything is connected that way. But, as you'll see, there's a second level to reality. And the Buddhists call this the superficial level of reality, meaning superficial as in the sense, this is the level at which we apply labels. So it's practical for me to call this a remote. Yes, is it truly kind of this interconnected thing, just some cells that will fall away someday and decay? Yes, just like me, that's true. But in order to get by in the world, we have to think of this as the remote. And you have to think of me as Professor Cuddy. And I have to think of that as the camera. Even though deep down it's all connected and I'm not really Professor Cuddy, I'm just part of the universe, it's practical to give labels so we can get by in the world. So in other words, when someone says, oh, Mr. Buddhist, just jump in front of the train and merge with the universe, the Buddha says, no, it's not a practical thing to do. Right? They say, the Buddhists will say, I acknowledge that there is a practicality to life, that there is a level of life that is superficial. So a Buddhist isn't swayed by that objection. A Buddhist goes through his life doing practical things. A Buddhist could work at McDonald's, right? A Buddhist could go through life doing normal things. It's just the difference is that a Buddhist always has a deep appreciation of impermanence in the back of his mind. So even if let's just take the McDonald's example, even if he's working at McDonald's to make money, if he loses that job or something bad happens at work, he always reminds himself, oh, well, it's impermanent though, right? It's all kind of just part of this greater whole. and he doesn't get attached, right? He's not gonna get in a fight with his coworker over how to make the Big Mac. Now let's tie this in to no self. But I want to emphasize that the Buddhist is not saying literally there's no self, but what it really means is false self, falsely perceived self. So Buddhists acknowledge that we have something we call a self. It's the same thing as the issue of impermanence. It's just that we give a label to it, and instead of just appreciating that as a label, we take it to be permanent, right? So instead of just saying, well, you're calling me Professor Cuddy because it's practical, we're thinking, well, Professor Cuddy, I will exist forever on some level. And that's where the error comes in. That's where the suffering comes in, because instead of understanding that I'm impermanent, including my very self, I think it's permanent. And I think it will always be present. It will always be there. So as you can see on that slide, our cells are regenerating. For a Buddhist, especially when we meditate and we look inward, we don't see any center or core. And again, I encourage you to test the Buddhist hypothesis here in your own meditation. What happens when you just sit in silence for 1 or 2 minutes? Most of us have the experience of the monkey mind, which is just thought after emotion after emotion. Where is the self, right? Where is the permanent thing there? Where is the core? The Buddha says it's not there. Once we search and we look inward, there's no center to it. And we find that it's just a label we've given to this collection of cells that we're calling our bodies, this collection of matter we're calling our bodies. And the self is pernicious because we've been developing ourselves since we were young. This is very instructive to remember that infants don't really have a sense of self yet. A sense of self develops over time. In fact, there's some evidence that infants can't tell the difference between their hand and the environment around them. Right? Infants just seem to exist. And it's only over time that we start saying, oh, look at little Jimmy, he's such a good swimmer, or whatever. And then Jimmy becomes a swimmer when he's older, and he labels himself as a swimmer, and he starts to believe that swimming is a permanent characteristic of who he is. But it's really just a label that has applied and has built up over time. So our self is constantly being developed by society, by what others tell us, by our own conceptions of who we are. Say, oh, you're a really smart kid, right? You're a really smart kid. Yeah, I'm a smart kid, right? And now you start to think, I'm smart, as though that is always going to be the case. So society develops, our genetics develop our self, but for a Buddhist, it's all false. It's false in the sense that it's not permanent. We have an incorrect relationship to those things in their view. And it's so pernicious that even when you meditate and you have a moment of no self, or you have a moment where the monkey mind goes away, the instant you stop, it comes pouring right back in. Right? The false self comes right back in. You might have a great experience in the woods, one of those moments of higher awareness, and then you come back to your job at Target and you get angry at a customer. Right? Your false self has come back. Your false self has come back into the equation, has come back into the picture. And metaphorically, you can see how pernicious that square is in the lower right figure on the PowerPoint. That's not a square though. Right? There's no square there. And yet, no matter how many times we look back and convince ourselves that it's just the placement of the little Pac-Man figures in the right place, the square just keeps coming back to our mind. So that's how harsh the self is. That's how pernicious the self is. It just keeps, our whole universe, our whole world, everybody around us is making us believe that we have a permanent self. So it's an uphill battle to remind our being that there is no permanent self. That's why meditation is so important in Buddhism. And let me just give you an example of how to see this in practice during meditation. So if you're meditating, and again, you can pause this video and do this right now. Just take 1 or 2 minutes and try to be silent in your own mind. Just sit in silence and try not to think. See what happens. What's most likely going to happen is first, you're probably going to think about not thinking. You're going to say, oh, I'm not thinking. But you're still going to be thinking. But if you do get to the point where your thoughts really cease and there's a little moment of peace there, That is your Buddha nature, which I'll talk about soon. That is the who you really are. That is what should shine forth over your false self. Your false self is the monkey mind. Your false self is all those stupid thoughts about, this is what I should have said. Oh, I'm so scared about the test in the future. Oh, I want to get this job. That's your false self. And the idea is that as you meditate more and more, those moments of peace between all the BS thoughts, those moments of peace expand. So that when you're meditating, you're just in peace now, instead of having all these thoughts shoot around. By the way, don't make the mistake of saying, oh, my mind is so much worse than everyone else's. My mind, I can't stop my mind at all. That's true for everyone. It's not just you, right? Sometimes people say that as a barrier to meditation, like, oh, my mind's different. Your mind is not different. Everybody has the experience of a monkey mind. Everybody has the experience of a mind that is hard to control, that gets away from them. So you're not unique in that way. You might be unique in a lot of other ways, but it's very clear that all humans share that trait of the monkey mind.